Welcome to the Organisation Design module. This is probably the most skillful area for any professional, never mind HR and learning professionals. It's skillful on many levels. Obviously there are the technical skills and knowledge required, knowing how to meld together structure, process, system, culture. It's also a very political job. Obviously organisations are human organisms and people play political games. Organisational change is messy and you can't ignore that. You can't stop the organisation, you have to work with it while it's moving forward anyway. So let's keep all of these facets of organisation design in the back of our minds as we work through this module. This is the Organisation Design module. We will quickly look at the complete framework for organisation design, which includes all the component parts, before moving on to look at some of the building blocks, including systems and processes. Then we move on to organisation charts and do some analysis of what is a good and what is probably not a good organisation. And finally we finish by looking at processes. We're going to look at the complete framework for doing organisation design, and this is the only slide that is repeated in the whole of the Consummate Professional series. The other version is in the Business Partner Consulting module. Here we need to concentrate though on the organisation design implications. So, briefly to summarise, every organisation needs to try and guess what the future looks like and have its own vision. It then produces a mission statement, although we tend to call it a value statement. In other words, what value do we want to create, and what values do we want to enshrine in the way we run our organisation. From the value statement comes the business strategy, how will we create value. From the business strategy comes the business plan, which is anything more than 1 year. So how much value, for example, do we want to create over the next 3 years? And at the operating plan level we have the numbers to actually run the business today. Now underneath this planning process is an organisation design process, and this consists primarily of a three-cornered triangle, the golden triangle of organisation structure. That's how you produce an organisation chart. The processes the organisation uses, and these two things come together to define the roles of individual employees. But we need to overlay on top of this a system, an organisational system, and we will do that in a moment or two. We are not going to talk about the other aspect of organisational design, culture, on this particular module, but obviously this is very, very important. And whether it happens by default or by design, every organisation will have its own culture. So this is the overall game plan. This is the complete framework from which we start to design the organisation. As we said earlier, you can't stop the organisation to put this framework in place. You've got to work with the existing framework and somehow help to redesign it in very subtle ways often, so it starts to produce a much more organic, much more self-reinforcing learning organisation. Now, although it's messy, what you can do is start to address specific parts of the framework, specific areas. But you've always got to keep one eye on all of the other areas that you need to consider. So you can't do any of this in complete isolation. And again, I think that's a key part of organisation design. You're never going to be getting away from that unless you are working with a brand new greenfield site. So what we're now going to do is look at two of the key building blocks of organisation design, which is system and process. Here are two key building blocks of any organisation design: the systems the organisation uses and the processes that it uses to operate. These two words are often interchanged by people, and actually that's a mistake because they have very specific meanings. So let's have a look at what these specific meanings are. A system is a means for making sure that what you plan to happen actually happens. So for example, a traffic light system means that people stop at a red light and move safely on at green. When a system breaks down, the organisation is really in trouble. The financial system of several countries is quite shaky at the moment, and the banking system nearly collapsed back in 2007-2008. Basically what this meant was the system had allowed people to make rash or too risky lending decisions, and eventually those systems started to collapse. That is how important systems are in any organisation. But let's not confuse them with a process. A process is a series of steps that turns inputs into outputs. So going back to the traffic lights, the sequence of red, amber and green lights are the inputs into that process, and the outputs is when the traffic moves or stops according to what we want to happen. A process always sits within an overall system. It never works the other way around. And any professional organisation designer needs to be absolutely clear in their own mind what these two terms mean. Otherwise, they will not be able to improve them through better design. So system and process are two key building blocks, and another one is the structure of the organisation. And immediately we hit up against a problem in organisation design. Which one of these things do we deal with first? Now, some people even say there is a question mark over, do you have strategy first or structure first? Well, I suppose the obvious answer is you should always start with the business or organisational strategy, and then everything flows from that. And that would be true in a brand new organisation. But the chances are most of you using these modules are working in existing organisations, either internally or as a consultant or whatever. And they already have strategies and they already have structures. So organisation design particularly starts to look at system and process, and then it says, well, can we improve the structure? And while you're dealing with any one of these, you constantly have to think about the impact it has on the others. They are all interrelated. But let's look at ways of improving the structure first. A professional organisation designer needs to become highly competent in organisational analysis. And the most obvious place to start when doing an analysis of an organisation is to look at the existing organisation charts. Although a note of caution, these very, very rarely reflect the existing situation at any particular point in time. They are constantly changing and often changing by default. But let us take a look at this relatively simple organisation chart. We would probably describe this as a typical silo or chimney type organisation chart, where there are three functions or three departments. The operations department run by the operations director, the finance department run by the finance director, who also has some responsibility for administration, and the sales, and let's call it sales and marketing, run by the sales director. This is a very simple way to actually design an organisation chart, and there is nothing inherently wrong with this, except that as soon as we start to scratch beneath the surface, there are all sorts of weaknesses built into silo-based organisation structures. One of the most obvious questions to ask when you look at an organisation chart is, what are the three directors here actually accountable and responsible for? So for example, we could presume that the sales director is being measured in terms of sales performance, and we might presume as well that the operations director is being measured in terms of, say, customer service and how much they keep their costs under control. Yet if we take the value question, which is who is actually responsible for creating value, which is a combination of looking at costs and revenue and quality, then if we split this responsibility between different functional silos, we are inherently building in a conflict of interest between senior people. This is a classic weakness in silo-based organisations. And what is the finance director actually responsible for? For making sure that they produce an accurate profit and loss account or a balance sheet, or do they have some direct accountability for profitability in the organisation? You might notice here also there isn't an HR department. That's partly to keep this analysis quite simple. But often, many organisations have HR reporting into the finance director. Now you could ask yourself the question, why is that the case? Now, regardless of the arguments for it, there should be a serious question over the views of the organisation about the way they manage people if they think the finance director should be ultimately responsible for this. Now, if we look on the right hand side of this organisation chart, we have a very simple direct reporting line: sales director, sales manager, area sales and sales administration. Now, if this was literally how many people worked in this organisation, we would have to ask ourselves the question, is there too many layers of management here? Why do you need a sales director and a sales manager when there's only one area salesperson? So again, this is a simple question you would ask in any organisation. How many direct reports does each manager have? There is actually no absolute answer to this question, and most people would advise anywhere between, say, 5 and 10 direct reports. Some would say 10 is too many, but certainly that is the sort of ballpark figure that we might be looking for. One final comment on this particular organisation chart are the actual lines showing who reports to who, and we have 3 directors reporting to the CEO. And in some organisations these days they have matrix organisations, and often on a matrix organisation chart it might look very similar to this, but there may be dotted lines. So for example, the administration manager here, who reports into the finance director, may be heavily involved in administration with the sales administration team, so there may be a dotted line to the sales director for the areas that they get involved in for them. Whilst matrix organisations can have some advantages, one of the inherent problems in matrix organisations is having more than one boss. And I would argue this is almost a golden rule of organisation design, that you never want to give anybody more than one boss at any particular point in time, because their natural reaction might be to play one boss off against another and get them to argue about what their priorities are. Now, if we produce an organisation chart for a much larger organisation, maybe a global organisation and one with very complex organisational attributes, you might find that at the executive or board level there are a whole range of directors or vice presidents without having such obvious titles as operations, finance or sales. Now again, any organisational analyst should ask the question of all of these individuals, what exactly are your duties? What is your role? Where do you fit into this organisation? What are you responsible for? What are you accountable for? And how is your performance being measured? These are all classic questions that any organisational analyst should always ask. If an organisation chart was going to stay the same forever, there wouldn't be any opportunities for improving it. That might be a statement of the obvious. But in practice, a lot of reorganisation happens by default, happens at a very low level or a middle manager level. Teams get moved around, people move somebody from one team to another. And nobody really takes on board how much this might be weakening the overall organisation structure. A good organisational analyst will start to pick up on this and will start to look for any opportunity to make sure that weaknesses don't appear and any opportunities are maximised. So let's have a look at a very, very simple example of a relatively small team that gets restructured. And we're going to look at a regional sales organisation, and here we have a regional manager who has 3 area managers reporting directly to them, and let's say that each area manager has a group of unit managers reporting to them. So there is a reasonable direct reporting line here. Now in practice this might work very well, and often it will depend very much just on the interpersonal skills of the regional manager to either make this sort of chart work or not. And then for whatever reason, one of these area managers either falls ill or decides to leave the organisation, and then this regional manager has to consider how he's going to cope with this change in their team, whether it's on a temporary basis or a permanent basis. And most regional managers, most middle managers, most first line managers would be allowed to do this sort of reorganisation and restructuring themselves. They'd be trusted to do it. Now, whether that's a good idea or not, the professional organisation designer should advise them that any change in an organisational structure can weaken that structure. And organisation design and organisational structures that result from organisation design are always a dynamic model, that if you change one part of the structure, it has an impact elsewhere. And it's also part of a complete system. So if you change one little piece of the system, it will have an impact elsewhere. So let's see what we mean by this. Let's imagine that this is the structure that this regional manager comes up with because one of their area managers decides to go and join a competitor. And maybe because business is a little bit quiet at the moment, they decide they don't want to fill the vacancy. They come up with a different chart. So what they've done here is they've left area manager 3 as they were before, but now they've taken area manager 1 because area manager 2 has left, and they've made area manager 1 responsible for both areas 1 and 2. Now, as soon as you do this, you might think that it's just a straightforward case of area manager 1 and 2 having to work a bit harder to look after 2 patches or 2 territories instead of 1. Well, that might happen, but if this person was already fully occupied, how can they cope with 2 jobs all of a sudden? Or even if it's quiet, how can they cope when they're already doing 100%? Now, apart from the fact that we're putting an extra burden on this area manager of area 1 and 2, what could happen in practice is pressure from their teams starts to mount, because the unit managers who used to have a certain amount of time from their own area manager are now sharing out their time, if you like, because that area manager for 1 and 2 cannot give them as much attention as they used to have when they were only a small team. So the pressure mounts, and the area manager of areas 1 and 2 could be encouraged to actually come up with a new role altogether, a sort of middle manager between them and their unit managers of a coordinator. Now, whether these people are unit managers who fulfill a coordinating role, but if area manager 1 and 2 can't get around the patch to see everybody, then these 2 coordinators could stand in for him or her. This is how organisations are constantly changing. And if this was a case of the area manager 2 just going ill, say long-term ill for 6 months, and area manager 1 and 2 try to cope, all of a sudden when area manager 2 comes back, what do? Do you go back to the original structure? Thinking particularly from an HR point of view, even if this does not result in new job descriptions and new person specifications for this role of coordinator, if the de facto situation is that somebody who's doing a unit manager's job is asked just on a friendly or part-time basis to step into a coordinating role, it means they may not be up to the job. Nobody's done an assessment of whether they need any extra skills to do this job. In fact, the coordinator's job could be a significant step up from a unit manager's job. And if nobody's been prepared for this, how well is this job going to be carried out? Now, apart from the organisational design lessons we have here, the more mechanistic ones of writing organisation charts, you'll notice, just using this very simple example, that the success or failure of teams can often be down to the willingness of people in these teams just to work well with each other, to cooperate, to be flexible at times of stress. So creating an organisational culture where this is more likely to be apparent than not is actually sitting behind this sort of approach to organisation design. The culture will always have a part to play. Well, we've just looked at a very simple organisation chart. And in fact, trying to use organisation charts to do any sort of organisation analysis can lead you into coming up with very simplistic answers. And it's very rare that I want to be accused of being simplistic. But I think if we just looked at an organisation chart in isolation, it would be too simplistic. But more importantly, the thing that we really need to take into account here is human beings. Because human beings are innately political. We want to
sometimes be in our comfort zone, so we want to protect our comfort zone. Others of us who are ambitious want to protect our turf, our territory. Senior managers want to create empires. We can get very upset if somebody else seems to be muscling in on our jobs, so we protect our function or our department. And a lot of this is about self-preservation, and a lot of it's about ego, and a lot of it's about status. And you cannot do organisation design without taking these human implications fully on board. So whilst we're looking at organisation charts, we need to bear this in mind. Probably the most stark examples of this are when you hear phrases like fiefdoms. I remember working for a large engineering organisation many years ago, where the divisional heads were called the barons of the organisation. And that wasn't an official title, but that's what everybody regarded them as. They controlled their own domain, and you were not allowed to do anything in their domain without their say-so. This is how organisations will operate, if left to their own devices. Now, an organisation designer, professional, who has an understanding of things like HR strategy and learning strategy, for example, will know this is probably not the best way to run an organisation, because it encourages people not to work with each other. It encourages a lack of cooperation rather than actual positive cooperation between people. So the organisation designer is trying to encourage the organisation to come up with a better way of working together. This might sound like it's becoming a huge challenge for you if you want to be a professional organisation designer. But like all the modules in this series, I always recommend that if you're not at a very senior level, that you start in very, very small but very powerful steps. So I'd like to go back to looking at the process in a bit more detail now, because one thing anybody could start to work on is the process.
We're going to look at a simple process, a sales process for selling photocopiers. And before we put the detail on this slide, you'll notice a diagram that looks a bit like a plumbing diagram where a lot of the pipes don't actually meet up. Well, this is not a bad way to view any process analysis as a plumbing scheme. And what the plumbing scheme tries to do is take the inputs, send them down the pipes, and at the end produce an output. Now, if you've never done any process analysis before and you've never drawn a process map, you might not know that counterintuitively the process map drawing process should always start at the end, because we want to know what the output is that we're seeking. So in this sales process, the end of the process will be when a photocopier is sold. And once you've established the end of the process and what output you want, then you go back to the beginning or the start and you say, well, what led to that photocopier being sold? Let us just work through one example and say that in a rather old-fashioned company, a customer rings up the company and has some questions they want answering. And in this particular company, the person who picks up the phone is somebody who works in reception. And this receptionist is at least taught that the first thing they should ask any customer is, are they an existing customer? Because any process that, if it's to work efficiently or not, should try and rule out any wasted time or effort. So training people to do their job efficiently means making sure they know which part of the process they're in and what their role and task is in that part of the process. So the receptionist asks the customer, are you an existing customer? And the reason they ask this question, because if they are an existing customer, then they will already have a nominated salesperson who looks after their account. And if they're not an existing customer, then they know to pass them through to a sales clerk who's going to take the details of this potential customer. Now, if we follow this piping diagram, at some point, whether it's the salesperson or the sales clerk, somebody needs to ascertain the customer's needs, find out what they really want. So let's look at some options. Perhaps they ask the customer, would you like one of our people to come and pay you a visit? And the customer says, no, thank you. Well, would you like us to send you some literature? And the customer says, no, thanks, I've got all the literature I need. So the question is, well, how can we help? And the customer says, I know the photocopier I want, but your book price is a bit higher than I want to pay. I wonder if I could get a discount. Now in this particular process, the way this organisation is designed, the culture of this organisation even, is that anything to do with money has to be decided by a managerial level post. So this call has to go through to the sales manager. And yet the sales manager might be busy, or they might just say, I haven't got time to deal with this, or whatever. Either way, if anybody blocks the process, then at the end of this process there won't be a photocopier sold. But also we can ask about the judgment and the ability, the skills of the sales manager to make a judgment call to say, should I take this call or not? Are they likely to be a big customer or a small customer? They almost do a mental Pareto analysis straight away to find out, is it worth making the effort, or would I be better spending my time on other customers? Now let us assume that this sales manager speaks to this customer and they say, well, we can't give you a 10% discount, but I'll give you a 5% discount. And the customer says, okay, that sounds good. But actually, they then ask for a demonstration. Now what this does is actually set up a new process, a sub-process. Somebody has to go out and do a demonstration of this particular model on the customer's premises, or actually get them to come in so they can do a demonstration. Now this demonstration process might be handled by another department, and if they don't do their job properly, then that will stop the photocopier being sold. So you can see very quickly all processes, all plumbing in an organisation joins together. You can't take a bit of it on its own. If they don't want a demonstration, then hopefully you go straight to selling a photocopier. A very, very simple process, and any organisational analyst will ask the question, is everybody doing their job properly? How long does it take to get from start to finish? What are the costs involved? And also, if the sales manager is too busy, who else in this process could take on the role on price queries? And how much leeway would you allow them? What would be their limit of authority? A famous story from Penguin Books showed an accounts clerk giving discounts away to bulk buyers of books, and they had no authority at all on paper to actually give any discounts, and it cost Penguin millions of dollars in lost discounts before anybody found out what was happening. This is how important process analysis is to the organisation designer. Now to finish this module, what we're going to do is pull several ideas together on one slide. This is the complete process, but it also takes into account the structure of the organisation, which departments each person in the process belongs to. And it also looks at how efficient this process is, and it looks at each individual role and how you use people in the process. So we're going to draw another process diagram, but from a slightly different angle, showing how it links all three departments in this organisation together. We have to start again at the end, and the end in this case is going to be when payments are received for actually selling and delivering a photocopier to the customer. Then we go back to the beginning of the start, and we had a receptionist who answered the phone, and then we join these two up and see who else is involved. And as we go through this, you'll see different colour codings to represent different departments, as seen on an earlier organisation chart where we had the operations, finance and sales departments. So the receptionist passes the first call through to the sales manager regarding the price query. The sales manager in this case decides to send out an area representative to go and speak to the customer. And let us assume that the representative does a good job and actually sells a photocopier to the customer. They then have to instigate somebody in dispatch getting a photocopier, putting it on a van and sending a driver with a photocopier to the customer. This then produces some more paperwork for sales administration. The driver gets a signature from the customer to say it's been delivered, and this goes through to sales administration, who can now process the invoice for the goods. And hoping that the customer is going to pay on time, they copy it through to credit control to make sure that they do. And if all works well, the payment is received at the end. This simple diagram with the different colours shows you there are 3 departments working here, all as part of the same process. It is the process that forces people to work together, not the department that they report to. And we can ask all sorts of questions here. Who is responsible for what? What is the role of the sales manager? How much can they delegate to the area representative? And an even more interesting question is, who's responsible for credit control? Because if we look at the behaviour of the salespeople, if they know they don't have to chase bad debts, then they'll put all their efforts into making sure they make a sale without mentioning to the customer that one day they might have to come to them to collect some money. Some organisations have decided a better way to do this is to make credit control the responsibility of somebody in the sales team, not in the accounting or finance team. They think the person who sells the product should be responsible for making sure they get paid at the end of the day. So the golden triangle of process, structure and role is shown on one simple diagram.
I would strongly recommend that if you are relatively new to organisation design, or if you don't have much confidence in this area, that probably the best place to start is to look at a single process, just to build up your confidence in your skills. Go and identify a process first. Go and map it, but in very, very simple terms, and you can use one of the exercises to do this. And start to look at the implications for the organisation from a value perspective first. If you improve that process, how could it create more value? But at the same time, if you're going to redesign a process, you have to think about the human beings currently involved in that process and how they're going to react and respond to a change in one of their basic operational processes. You might still meet up with resistance from the managers in that particular area, the ones who maybe own that process. But if you've got a good value argument that says this is worth looking at, then it's very difficult for them to say, well, I don't want you to look at that if it's an area for improvement. But I would normally recommend that you work with people. We're not trying to catch anybody out. We're trying to help the organisation learn how to become a better designed organisation itself. I'm not sure there is such a thing as a perfect organisation designer or even an expert. It's a subject that doesn't lend itself to dry academic analysis, because you're dealing with human beings who have their own secret hidden agendas, who have their own selfish interests at heart. They want to protect their jobs. So I think a professional organisation designer isn't necessarily the best expert in the world, but there's somebody who takes on board the full size and import of these human drives, the things that actually will shape organisations anyway. But the best professionals build that into their design principles. They say, well, it's not just about process, it's not just about structure, and it's not just about system. It's how we get the people in this organisation to really want to make this design work for the best.